This dashboard was created from scratch using Bubble connected to the Shopify, Facebook ads, and analytics APIs. And I'm going to show you how to recreate it. It may not look like much, but I promise, there's a fair amount going on under the hood. This would be a perfect project for anyone who wants to learn how to interact with the Facebook or Shopify APIs using a no-code tool like Bubble. And if you don't think you can do it, you can. Anyone can. I built it myself with no experience and nothing but the help of ChatGPT. So in this video, we're going to rebuild this dashboard layer by layer with each new concept building off a previous one. We'll troubleshoot any bugs that come up, and at the end, we would have learned a ton. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start with Shopify. What we can do is we can go to the apps area and select app and sales channel settings. And then we'll go to the develop apps area and create a new app. So let's just call this test. Now that you're in the test app options area, we can set up the configuration, which is the permissions that we're going to allow this app to have access to. So in our case, since we want to do a dashboard that shows the order information, we're going to need essentially the orders API and the customers API. So that we'll select read analytics, we'll select customers, orders, and we'll do reports as well. We're only selecting the read option because we just want to access the data. We don't actually want to write anything back to Shopify, especially if this is our first app, then we want to make sure we don't mess up anything on the back end of our Shopify stores. So once we've done that, we can go ahead and save. And then head on to the next area, which is the API credentials. And we can just go ahead and install this app. So now that we saved, we've given this app access to the permissions that we just shared. And in order to access those data points, we will need to give Bubble these three pieces of information. So we've got an access token here, we've got an API key, and a secret key. So we're just going to save this information and use it for later. So we can reveal this so that we actually see the token, so we can copy that. And then we have the API key, which we can copy that. And then the secret key as well, which we can show, but we can also just copy it without showing. So once you have your API key and tokens, we can head over to Bubble. If you go to the plugins page, you can add plugins, and you would look for the API connector. So that's this one right here. In our case, we already have it installed, so we don't need to go and install it again. And then you can actually create API calls. So I've already have some from before because we've already been working on creating this dashboard. But what we can do is we can add another API for the new Shopify API details that we just created. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this to HTTP basic auth. And then we're going to copy and paste the API key for the username and the access token for password. Okay, so now we need to make the API call. So we can call this the Shopify API call. And if we head over to the API documentation, this is the order API page, and there's a bunch going on here, but we can actually jump to these endpoints. So the endpoint is a call that we can make to retrieve a certain type of information. And so in this case, we want to retrieve a list of orders. And so this is what it looks like right here. So we're going to copy that, and we're going to place that in here. But we're going to notice that this is actually supposed to be in URL, but this is missing the store name. What we're going to do here is we're going to add the My Shopify URL. So in this case, it's storename.myshopify.com. and then the rest of the endpoint right there. And we can go ahead and initialize, and we'll see that if it works, we'll see all of these, all of this information. If it didn't work, it'll give you an error message. So here we are. We can look at all the different values that we get back. So there's the order ID. We can see things like the price of the order, right? So that's the value of the order right there, and other information like the customer name and address, and really anything about the order that we'd be able to find on Shopify, we can find here in the API call. I'm going to cancel out of this because there are actually other parameters that we might want to include with the API call that allows us to filter the information down a little bit more based on what we might want. And so in this case, we can look at created at max, created at min. So if we use both of these, it'll give us a date range that we're going to be looking at. Otherwise, right now, it's just looking at pretty much all orders, and maybe we don't want to do that. There's going to be a limit as well, so 50. So what this is how many results are we going to get back per call? And that call by default is going to have 50. So if we use limit, we can actually increase that to 250. So we're going to do that. And the last one is status. So status by default, if we don't add it, it's only going to show the open orders. If you do any, then it'll actually show any of these three. In order to add the parameters, we can create these fields here. And so if we wanted created at min, we can do that. And we need to feed it a date. You're going to see that it requires an ISO 8601 format. So that's going to be, it's going to be a format that looks like this. So it's year, month, day, and then the time, and then it'll be hours, minutes, seconds, and then there's going to be a time zone. So I'm in the Eastern time zone, so that would be -4. So this is the format, but when initializing the call, we actually have to put real numbers in. So what we'll do is we'll set this to, let's say, August 1st. And we're going to make this midnight on August 1st. So there we go. Okay, next parameter, let's do created at max. So this will be the upper end of the time frame. And what we'll do is we'll actually use the same date, but instead of being midnight, we'll make it 11:59. So it'll be the full day on August 1st. Next, we want to use the limit parameter. So let's set limit to 250. And then let's set status to any. And we actually already have status here in the URL. So I'm going to delete this here, because what's going to happen is when you put the parameters here, Bubble will actually automatically append it to the URL when it makes the call. So this just makes it a little bit easier for us to work with, but you could also put all of this information directly into the URL. And what we're going to do is we're also going to think about whether we want this private or not. By keeping it checked, that means that the program later on will not have access to these parameters. But if you want to actually change these dates as part of your dashboard, then you're going to want to uncheck this. So then it's no longer private. And when you make these calls, you can actually change these numbers in your web app. So that's what I'm going to do there. And I'm going to initialize the call. Now we have all this information coming in, and we can see that it's created for August 1st, and we can go ahead and save that. All right, so now we've created the Shopify API call. Next, we have Facebook. So first we can navigate to developers.facebook.com and create an account and head over to My Apps. So we can create a new app. And we're going to select Other because we're actually going to be working with ads management. So let's go ahead and select that. We're going to say Business because, again, we're working with ads. And let's just call it Test. And we'll want to select a business manager. Okay, so now it's going to ask us to add some products. We're going to be looking for the marketing API. So let's set that up. Once we've installed the marketing API, we can go to the tools and select permissions that we want to give. In our case, we just want to be able to read the ads. So let's get token. And we can just copy this and save that for later. So now that we have the Facebook token, we can do a similar process to make the Facebook API call. So let's call this new Facebook API. And in this case, we're going to use the private key in header. We're going to have that set to authorization. And then we're going to copy and paste the token in. And we're also going to add the word bear up front. Okay, so for the API call, we can call this Facebook API call, and we will use the API call with this URL. Where your account number will actually go in this area here. And then we're going to want to add parameters. And so this page here will show you all the different parameters that are associated with the Facebook API call. We won't go through all of it, but I think it is going to be really useful for you to be familiar with what you can and can't do. But ultimately, anything that you can do in the ad account, you can also filter through with the API. You just need to find the parameter for the column that you're looking for. I think similar to what we were doing in Shopify, we're going to want to do a time range. So if we look down here, we can actually see there's a time range, and it's going to have this format here. So we can copy that, add a parameter, and we call this time range, and we can add the value there. And we're going to set that to public like we did last time so that we're able to change that later on. Okay, so let's change the date to be August 1st again. And we'll keep the same date. It'll be a single day again. And let's try to initialize that. Right, we won't be able to do that because we actually need to provide certain fields to show. So why don't we add that? So there is actually a fields parameter right here. And if you go to the middle of the page here, there's a list of the fields that we can actually pull. For us, we're interested in clicks, impressions, purchases. You can go through this list and look at which ones interest you. They should line up with what you see in your ads manager. So I'm going to just copy and paste the ones that I want here. And then I also need to add a filtering field because right now I'm using actions and action values, which is a fields that allow me to have access to the purchases and the purchase conversion value, but it's not directly accessible like clicks. So I actually have to add filtering. This will make sense once I make the call, but you'll see that there's an action type and the value would be purchase. Let's initialize that call. Still getting an error. Okay, so I think what we are missing here is actually some quotations around the date. So let's add that in. And let's try that again. Okay, there we go. So now that we have got the call to work, we can actually see the structure of the data that's coming in. And so you can see here, there's actions, and then the action type we want is purchase. And so it pulls that purchase, and then it pulls the value, so how many purchases we're getting, because we want to get the count of the number of purchases. Same thing here, the action values, right? So this is purchase conversion value. So that's why it's an action value. And the number associated with that is the dollar amount of purchase conversions that we got. And so that's how we pull those pieces of information. We need that because we're going to be using it in our dashboard. So we can go ahead and save that. And now we've made our Facebook API call. Now that we've set up the API calls, we can use them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to the design tab, and we're going to create a new page. So we'll call this test page, and it'll just be a blank page. If you've never used Bubble before, there's all these different items that you can use. So we can create a text box here, hello world, and we can preview that, and in a matter of seconds created our very first page with hello world on it. We can create all sorts of different shapes based on what's available here, but we're going to keep this app simple and just work on the basic functionality behind calling the information and displaying it on the page. And so text boxes are going to be a really great use for that. We set up the API with Shopify. So what we can do is we can insert dynamic data, and we would get data from an external API. And there's going to be a list here, but the one we just created was called new Shopify API. So right here, new Shopify API and new Facebook API. Facebook API call is the one we called the Facebook one. Let's put that in there, and then it's going to ask for the dates that we want in there. So we can just leave that as default, but the reason why this is showing up is because we had previously set it to private. So if you remember, we set these as public. So if I actually check that and we come back here, you're going to see that disappear. So we actually want to be able to see that. So we're going to uncheck that again, and now we have the parameter available. So let's just leave this alone for now. So this will call the Shopify API between those dates. And then it's going to go through the structure of the Shopify API. So if we go back to the orders API page, there's sort of a diagram on how some of that structure looks. So you have the order, and then below the order, you've got these different buckets. So let's go back to retrieving an order. And they have a sample response here. This is a little bit hard to read, but you can see here under orders, right? And then you've got this indent, and then you've got these different parameters that we have. So all of these are within the orders. So if we come back to Bubble and we say orders, you're going to see that those same parameters are available. So we've got ID, so that's ID right there, and then admin GraphQL API ID, admin GraphQL API ID, app ID, browser IP, app ID, browser IP, and so on and so forth, right? So it'll map all of those exact same parameters in the structure that the API returns the information. And so Bubble can read that and makes it easier for you as a drop-down list to be able to select what you're looking for. So in our case, let's say we want to get the order ID. And so this is each item's ID. Because we're looking over a course of an entire day, then it's going to return all the orders that were placed during that day. So why don't we give that a try? And there you go. We've got a bunch of numbers that represent all of the different orders of that day. But that's not really useful for us in this case. So maybe if we wanted to know how many orders we had, then we can actually do count. And if we do that, then we're going to see that we had 48 orders that day. Maybe we are interested in the revenue of that day. So I'm just going to copy and paste this, and we're going to change this from order count to order total price. There we go. And if I leave this on its own, it's going to list all the 48 total prices, but we're going to actually sum them together instead. Okay, so I want to sum them, but I can't. So most likely the reason for that is because of a formatting issue. And so if we come back to the plugin and we reinitialize the call, if we go to total price, there we go. It's formatted as text. It's text, then Bubble will know that it's not something you can do mathematical operations on. But in our case, we want this to be considered as a number. So we have to pay attention to the types of variables that we're pulling back from this data. So in this case, it's a number. In other cases, for example, this right here, created at, this is a date. So we actually don't want this to be text either. We want it to be in the date format. So then we can do date type operations. When you're looking at all the information that you want to grab, we also have to start paying attention to the format of that data that's coming back. And so I'm going to save that. And then now we should be able to perform a sum. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and preview. And there we go. So that's the value right there. So if we wanted to maybe add some text here, we could say conversion value $, and then maybe this one will say purchases, and then we can preview that again. There we go. Purchase 48, conversion value $2,000. So now if we wanted to pull the Facebook ads data, then we can do something similar. We're going to insert dynamic data. We're going to pull from the API. This is the API call we created for that. And we can just use the default again, close. And it's going to follow the structure of the Facebook API. We want to say count the number of purchases. So if we remember, that was going to be under data and then actions, action type. So let's come back here. So we have data, actions. Sorry, the action type was purchase. So we actually want the action value, each item's value. So we can actually go ahead and refresh the page. And there we go, 40. As we know, Facebook and Shopify aren't always going to align. So that's why that number isn't matching up. But that's the number of purchases we have there. And we can also find the conversion value. So we'll create a new text box, delete, insert dynamic data, get data from API, Facebook API call, and then we're going to go data, and we're going to this time go action value because that's the conversion value. And then again, it's going to be each item's value. There we go. So we can preview again, and there we go. So that's the number there. Now we'll do basic formatting to make the page easier to read, but I'm going to speed through this part. Bubble makes it pretty intuitive to build the outline of a page, and here all we're doing is adjusting rectangles and font sizes and changing colors. If you've worked with Microsoft Paint or Office, then you'll know how to do this. If any of you want to see this in more detail, just let me know in the comments below. We'll leave it at that for now, but let's move on to create something a little bit more complex with the calculations here. So right now we're just pulling the data directly from the API. What if we want to do a calculation? So in our API call, we actually are only pulling spend, impressions, clicks, purchases, and purchase conversion value. But what if we want, for example, cost per click? So that's actually a calculation. It's going to be spend divided by clicks. Why don't we go ahead and do that? So in this case, we need to go back. And so it'll be the datas and then the spend. And in this case, I'm actually going to sum the data, which I'm going to need to change the format for first. So spend is actually text right now. So let's change that to a number. Impressions should be a number. Clicks should be a number. And let's change all of these. Great. This way the data will be pulled properly and we can do the operations that we want. So sum, and then we're going to want to divide the spend by the clicks. And so we can go back to the API call, and this is the one that we have here, Facebook data, and we are going to get the clicks, and then we're going to sum that up, and there we go. So let's preview that. Okay, that's not showing up properly. We saw it flash in, but it's not staying on the page. First off, this should be cost per click. So CPC. But this seems like a formatting issue. So let me limit the number of decimal points that are being shown and see if that solves the issue. Okay, so what was happening was that there was a large number of decimal points that were longer than the space available for the number to be shown. But once I formatted the number and just said only 2 decimal places, then it'll stay on the page. Back to the calculation. This calculation is actually incorrect because we're doing clicks divided by spend when it should be spend divided by clicks. So let's go back and redo this. So we'll be getting the spend, dividing it by the clicks, and formatting it so there's only 2 decimal points. Okay, so if we preview this, we should get our cost per click, which is 52 cents. So now that we know how to print information on the page and do a simple calculation, we can go a little bit further. So right now, these API calls are actually making a call that is hard-coded. So it's hard-coded to August 1st, and this won't change. So if we actually go visit the page, there's no way we can actually change that date. We can change it on the back end, but if we load the page again, there's no way to actually access a way to choose the date that we want. So what we can do is we can add a date picker. So if we search date in here, there's a date time picker. So why don't we put one up at the top, and let's call this date time picker. Let's call this start date. And let's do another one. And let's call this end date. Let's call this end date picker and start date picker. Okay, so now we have a way to select the date. So why don't we do a really quick experiment with just printing the date that it's selected. So we got end date picker, and we could do start date picker, or sorry, end date picker. This one should be start. And it was actually read before, so you can see that there's an error. And we can actually pull this up. It'll tell us what the problem is. So it must be printable as text, but instead this is an element. So what does that mean? It means that we need to actually provide some more parameters to it. So in this case, the value, we want to print the value of the picker. And same thing here, we want to print the value. Okay, so let's preview this. We can select the first and the second. Okay, so we've got August 1st, 2023 at 12 a.m., August 2nd, 12/23 at 12 a.m. So that's our date range there. If we come back to the orders API, it says that it needs to be formatted in a specific way. So what we have here is not formatted in the way it's asking for it. And same thing with the Facebook API call. The format is actually specified here in the text, right? So it needs to be like this. And we can actually go back to the Shopify one, and we can see how it has to be formatted like this. Okay, so how do we do that? We can consider the Shopify version, which has a little bit more complexity in the date format because you have the date and then there's this time associated with it. But with the Facebook call, you actually, the parameter has both the start and end date in it together. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the Shopify one because I think that's a little bit easier. I'm going to delete this portion here and I'm going to insert the start date picker, right? And then we can say the value. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to format it. So we can format it. We can look through the formatting options, but unfortunately, none of the options are the format that we're looking for. So I'm going to use custom, and here is where you can actually do some formatting. I'm just going to delete all of that, and we're going to say year, month, day. So this is the format that we're going to do. Because this is a start date picker, I actually always want the time to be at midnight, at the very start of the day. So I am going to just hard code that portion in, and I'm also going to hard code the time zone. Later on, as we want to get this app to be more and more complex and add more features, we can actually even do something to make the time zone portion a variable. But for now, we're just going to just hard code that in. And now we can do the same thing with the end date. So we're going to insert a dynamic element. I'm actually going to keep this portion here, which is 11:59 on the end date. So we'll always be at the very end of the end date that we pick. And we're going to do end date picker value, and then we're going to format it just like we did last time. So custom. There we go. Okay. So why don't we give that a try and see if this works. Okay, so by default, it wants to take the August 2nd purchases. So that's 37. But if I go back to the first, it will take the first to the second. That's 85. If I go further back in time, then we have 250. So remember the limit we actually set right here? That's the number that Shopify can actually pull at any one time. So we actually hit the limit there. But if we go to a date that's a little bit closer to August 2nd, maybe we won't hit that limit. Yeah, there we go, 128. And so when we deal with the page limit, then we have to start searching through different pages, but we won't cover that right now. We will get to that a little bit later when we talk about loops. But for now, I just wanted to show that we can create these date time pickers and then add them in as variables to our text boxes. And we can also do it for this text box, but we won't do it here because you've already seen me do it for this text box here. Okay, so for the Facebook call, this one's a little bit different because both the start date and the end date are actually in the same field. And so in this case, I'm going to just copy the format here and then delete that. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert an arbitrary text. So I can paste that back down in there. And what we're going to do is we're just going to delete this portion only. And we can insert dynamic data, and we can get the start date picker. We can do the value and format it just like we did previously. There we go. And then we can do the same thing here. There we go. And so what we've done here is we've combined both text elements and variable elements to be used in this parameter. And we formatted it so that it matches the format that the Facebook API is looking for, which is, year, month, day. And so now we can do a little preview and see what that looks like. So we can pick the date. And there we go. If we go back a couple extra days, number will grow based on the number of purchases during that time period. All right. So we're just going to change the rest of the text boxes so that they are pulling the dates from the date pickers. And now we could just test it out, make sure everything works okay. There we go. It's all being updated. I'm just going to quickly format the Shopify data so it looks kind of like the Facebook one, just to make it a little bit easier to read a little bit later. I'm not doing anything complicated here, just moving boxes around and changing fonts. There we go. But it doesn't need to be perfect, so we'll leave it like that. So the next thing we're going to look at are custom states. Custom states are kind of like variables. So if you can imagine, when we build out this dashboard with more and more information, we're going to have certain API calls that are going to repeat themselves. So we already have that here. We have the purchases, which looks for the value, action value from the Facebook API call, but we've also made that same call right here and divided it by the number of clicks. So maybe we don't actually need to keep calling the API over and over again. So what we can do is we can actually set a custom state. So if we just open up this menu page for the page itself and you hit the I, you can actually add a new custom state. So we can call this Facebook purchases. And we're going to set that as a number and create. And the value here, we'll leave that blank. And we're actually going to go ahead and create the rest. So Facebook conversion value, I'll set that as a number. I'm actually going to change this to FB as well. FB clicks, shop purchases. So this will be for the Shopify purchases, and we'll do shop sales. Okay, so all these are numbers. These are all custom states. And now we can do something with them, which is to create a workflow. A workflow is like an algorithm that's run when something happens. So you can create a series of steps if some trigger occurs. And so in this case, we're going to say we want to add an event, and we're going to say if when input's value is changed. So what's that input that's going to change? We're going to choose the date pickers, right? Because if we go back to the to these values here, we're going to change these to the custom states we just created. But these values are actually impacted by the date pickers. And so what we want to do is if the date picker changes, then we're going to change the value of that variable. So that's why we pick start date picker. Okay, so now what are we going to do? We have element actions, and we can do set state. And we're going to set the state of one of the custom states we just created. So for example, we can look for the custom states we just created. So we'll go under test page, and we can find them here. So we can start with, say, Facebook purchases. And what's the value of the Facebook purchases? Well, if we go back here, this is it right here. That's the formula. And we're going to get data from the API, and then it was Facebook API. And here we need to build a time range parameter similar to what we had done previously. We'll be combining text and the value of the date picker elements. Since you already saw me do this, I'll copy and paste over the expression and speed through this part. Right, so I tried to format this, but custom state is actually a number, not text. So we still want to keep this format as we still want to keep this state to be a number. So we're not going to apply any sort of formatting on it. So let's get rid of that. And there we go. So now that we've set this variable, let's go back to the field here, and we're just going to delete this, and we're going to set it to the state that we just created. So again, we can find the state in the page, and we would just did Facebook purchases. Okay, so this value here should be the same as what we had previously, but we know that we're actually using a custom state instead of having the variable created directly inside of the text box. Let's just run instead of doing any sort of debugging. And there we go. We have the purchases showing up. Not quite giving the value I'm expecting. Okay, so one of the things is that I had only set it to trigger if the start date was changed and not the end date. We'll have to fix that. So start date picker's value changes, then the value of Facebook purchases changes. But we might change the end date as well. So what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this, paste it, and now that we have the same thing, we can make this end date. So now if we change the start date or the end date, the value of the Facebook purchases is going to change. So let's refresh this and give that a try. Okay, it looks like there's some other problem here. So why don't we take a look at this again? And this is actually empty. Okay, these are actually both empty. I thought I had that pasted in there, but clearly not. So let's grab the arbitrary text. Let's copy this expression. There we go. And then let's do the same thing here. Okay, so let's preview this page and let's see how it works. Okay, so we're getting error here.
I think it's because there's no initial values for the date pickers. We're going to head back to the custom states, and we would want to set a default value, but
we're actually going to do this using a workflow because we can't actually set any dynamic value here, and we need it to be dynamic to take into account the fact that these date pickers change. So we're going to go back to the workflow area. We're going to create a new workflow when the page is loaded, and we're going to create an action here. And so this action is going to set the state, and that state is going to essentially be the initial state of each one of these. And so we're going to pretty much set up the exact same action. So I can actually copy this and, well, let's delete this one and then just paste. So now I've set the value of this variable to the value of the date picker when the page loads right away. And that way we don't have to worry about the error that we were getting previously. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the date pickers information, and we're actually going to set initial content. So right now it's not set to anything. So we're going to say the current date, and we're going to do the same thing for the end date picker, and it's going to be the current date. That way there's a value up front. So when the page is loaded, it can set the value to the current date. When we change it, then it will be modified. So let's give that a try. Okay, so let's change that. There we go. Okay, it changes along. Perfect. We're seeing that the Shopify sales number isn't updating properly, so we can take a quick look at what that is. And I think it's just a formatting issue. So let's just include the format because we saw it flash on the page, which indicated to me that just too many decimal places, which prevents it from showing up. Let's refresh that. And there we go. Perfect.
So we can go through the rest of these text boxes and define the workflows for the custom states that we created for them. Since this is mostly repetition, I'll speed through this part. Now that I'm creating the variable for the Shopify data, I actually realize here I'm going to need to make an API call for the start date and end date. So instead of having to constantly make that API call, I'm going to create another state that represents the start date and end date. So let's create a new state. So we'll do start date, type date, and we'll do an end date. And this way, when I come into here, instead of having to make that call, I can actually just call the state instead. So first we're going to need to create the action to set the state, and we're going to need to start date. And we're also going to need to make sure that's near the front so we can set the value here before we actually use it in a later step. And then let's just copy and paste that. And this one will be the end date. Okay, and we're going to move this. Oops. We're going to move this to the front again. Okay, so now we're setting the start date and the end date, and we're going to use it in our API call here for Shopify. Those variables are the exact same formulas as we created in our text boxes here. So we're going to go ahead and change them now. So this one is the number of purchases. So we can delete all of that. Select the Shopify purchases. This one will be the Shopify sales. We've already changed this one. And this one's a formula, so we're going to actually need to bring two values in. So we'll need the conversion value divided by the number of clicks. Okay, so we also don't want to forget that we want to format this data just in case the decimal places makes it so that it's unable to show. So we'll change that to 2 decimal places. We'll do the same thing here. And the same thing here. I like to use the comma separator for thousands as well. It just makes it easier to read for me. Okay, let's make sure everything works. Okay, it's not being updated properly because I forgot to include all of these updates to happen when the date picker changes. So we're just going to copy this here, and then we're going to change the reason why it's what triggers it. So we're going to replace that, and it's going to be the start date picker. Okay, so we'll close that, and then we're going to copy that and then make this one the end date picker. So we have, and then we'll just delete these old ones here. Okay, so what we've done now is we now have all of our actions that we created for when the page is loaded to also update whenever one of the two date pickers values changes. We also have start date and end date changing in both cases. We don't necessarily need to do that because if start date changes, we know end date doesn't change. So we can just delete that there. And same thing with end date. If end date changes, we don't really need to change our start date. So
I'll get rid of that one as well. Okay, so let's come back out here, refresh, and hopefully it all works okay. There we go. These Shopify numbers don't seem to be changing, but the Facebook data looks like it's working okay. Let's take a quick look. Right, okay, so there's a few issues here. Some sort of non-expression going on here. It actually just can't find the date and time picker. This is supposed to be based off of the state that we created. So we want to make that based off the start date and the end date. So we must have missed that earlier when we were changing these. Okay, and we'll do the same thing here. Okay, and most likely we'll also have to change these over here as well. Yep. And if you're having trouble following along, just let me know in the comments. I think once you start to understand all the different components of what's going on, then this becomes much easier. So I'm going to speed through some of these parts, but the core concepts that we're covering, how to pull from the API, how to create variables, what are workflows, these are the ideas that are going to be the most important, and you can adapt them to apply to your specific use case. Okay, so now let's give that a try. Awesome. Okay, so now that's being updated as we go along. So with the concepts we've learned so far, we've learned how to pull data from an API. We learned how to create custom states and to use text boxes to print those custom states. And we learned how to set the values of custom states via workflows. So with just those concepts alone, we can already do a lot of things. And so here we have a few metrics being shown, but there's a lot more metrics that may be interesting to you. So you can just look through the Shopify Orders API to see what other metrics are interesting to you, and we can and you can pull that and present it on your dashboard. I just wanted to make a quick comment on order of operations. So in this case, we did for cost per click, we did a little bit of math here. We did the conversion value divided by clicks. And so I'm just going to show a quick example. So I'm going to copy this text box here and paste it here. And so in grade school, we learn about the order of operations, right? So for example, if we have 1 plus 2 times 3, so let's 1 plus 2 times 3, then order of operations says that we're going to multiply 2 times 3 first, right? So 6, and then plus 1, so that'd be 7. But what Bubble does is it actually just works left to right, regardless of what the operator is. So Bubble is going to do 1 plus 2, 3 times 3, 9. And that's just something that we have to keep in mind, and why creating those custom states here is actually going to be really important, because they essentially act as the brackets that we're going to need. So if we consider these brackets, the brackets that we're going to need to do this type of math. So we're going to need to do a custom state where we calculate 1 plus 2, and then we can either do the second operation directly in the text box or create another custom state for that. But in order to adhere to the order of operations that we need for potentially more complex calculations on metrics that we want, we also need to keep in mind that the order of operations is going to be important. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at backend workflows and databases. So when I update the dates here, we're going to see there's this lag that happens. It takes a little bit of time for that Shopify sales data to show up. If we change it again, then again, it's quite slow. And this could be related to the fact that the Shopify API call takes a little bit of time. We got to do some calculations. There's a lot of data coming in and it has to update every single time. So what we can do to avoid that is actually have that data already available and we're just looking at it and doing a really quick calculation instead of having to call the Shopify API server every single time. And we can do that using databases and backend workflows. So a database is sort of like a table. So we can kind of go here and look at our data types. And I'm going to create a new type called demo shop data or shop orders and create. Okay, so here are the default columns that come with this data type, and we're going to create two new ones. So shop sales, and that's going to call that a number, and then shop purchases, also a number. So those two fields are going to match the purchases and sales numbers that we have here. So we have these two fields. If we go to the app data here, we can see here, this is the table. It's empty because we just created it, but it's got the shop purchases, shop sales information there. We'll also actually are going to want the date. So we're going to do the created at. There we go. And then so this way we know what date a certain order occurred. And while we're at it, we should probably do the order ID, which we can use as a text, and we can do order name, just to help us keep track of what's going on. So now that we have these 5 fields, we can make a call to the Shopify API, store all the data, let's say from the past week or the past month. And then instead of making that API call every time, we can now just refer back to the table, which will be a lot faster than what we're doing right now. So how do we make that call? Because we know that even just making the call here, getting a little bit of data, it takes a little bit of time. So we don't want to have that big lag every time we want to get this data. So what Bubble has is something called a backend workflow. And so we can access that right here. If you're on the free plan, then you may need to upgrade first before you can access these. But once you have, then you can create backend workflows. And this is different than the front-end workflows that we were looking at earlier. So if I go back to our test page, so this is our test page. Here, these workflows here are on the front end. So they are connected to what we see on this page here. The backend workflows are actually not connected to the page. They happen in the background on Bubble's servers. And so everything else that we've been doing so far has been done on what's called the client side, which is like in our browsers. But here, Bubble gives us the ability to run calculations or run processes in the background. So let's say we want to update information every night. So we can kind of do that when maybe the site's not so busy. So it's available during the day when things are a lot more busy. And so that's what we can kind of do here, where we can pull the data from the Shopify API at scheduled times and then just have that information readily available in the table and just call the data that's in the table. All right, so that is a bit of a mouthful, but what we'll do is we'll just work through an example so that makes a little bit more sense. So let's go back to the backend workflow and let's just create a new one. So new API workflow. We're going to call this demo shop workflow. And just so it's easier to see, I'm going to add a Z in front of it so that we can see it at the very end because this is organized alphabetically. And so that's available for us right here. Now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make an API call. And so if we go to the plugins area, we have a list of API calls that we can make. But what we don't see is the one that we had created earlier. All right, so the one we had created earlier, we called it new Shopify API. and Shopify API call, and we had new Facebook API and Facebook API call. But neither of those are available. The reason is because our API calls here have actually been created as a data type, whereas in these workflows, it actually has to be an action. So we can actually create another one for action. Now, we're not going to just change it because the API calls that we were using earlier needed to be a data type. So we'll just duplicate this. So I'll add another call and essentially put exactly the same information in, except we're going to make it an action. And so we'll just call this Facebook action API call. And we'll just copy and paste all of this. And initialize. And we'll update these types to be numbers so that we can run the appropriate actions on it later. This one is date and this one is date. Okay. And we'll do the same thing with the Shopify one. So we'll open this up and add another call. And we'll call this Shopify action call. Change this to an action. And a little bit of copy and pasting. Okay, we'll initialize. And we know that we want the created at, so I will change that to date first. And we want total price, so we'll make sure that's a number. And I think that's all we need for now. And if we need to change more later, then we can do that. Okay, so now let's come back here, create an action, and we should see our new action calls here. So new Facebook API, Facebook action, new Shopify API, Shopify action, and API call. So those are the two that we just created right now. And then now what we can do is we can create a new thing. We have a list of data types. So those are the data types we have created here. And the one we want to look at is the demo shop orders. So what we're going to create is demo shop orders. And if we open this up, we can set fields that correspond to the fields that we had created. So we want to create it at, we want order ID. We essentially want every single one of these. There we go. And what we're going to do is we need to set it to be equal to the value that we're getting from the Shopify API call. So if we come back here and we reinitialize, so remember we have this structure, right? So it goes orders and then ID or created at. So all of these are under the orders part of the call. So we're going to use the result of step one, which is actually the API call. So the results, orders, and then we want the ID. But it's going to give us a problem, right? And so what is that problem? It says when creating these, this demo shop orders, value should be date, but right now it is a list of texts. Okay, so there's two problems. One is I just chose the wrong value. We're not looking at this is created at, not the order ID. So let's just change that to the created at field. All right, but it's still going to give us a problem because it should be a date, but right now it is a list of dates. And so why is it saying that? Let's take a look. I'm going to delete this for now so that we don't have that problem. And just so I don't forget, I'm going to bring it back here. There we go. Okay, so we don't have that issue anymore. If we did have an issue, we actually wouldn't be able to preview properly. And I'm going to go back to our test page. And let's create a new text box. So I'll just create a big text box here. So we're going to insert a dynamic value. And we're going to call the API just like
we would have in the backend workflow here. So we're looking for the new Shopify API, and we're going to set this to be start date. There it is. And the same thing for end date. Okay. And we'll say the orders, and we wanted to create it at. So that's the one we were looking at. So what we're going to get once we show this is a list of values, right? So we have a whole bunch of dates showing up. But what we're trying to do here is we're actually trying to create an entry into the database, which is a single value. So this means we have to essentially loop through all these values. So we have all these values here. We have to one by one look at a single item, take that single item, place it into the table, then move on to the next one and place that one into a table, and then go to a third one and place that one into a table. So we have to break this down, and the way to do that is to perform an action on one item at a time, and that's typically done through a loop. Now, Bubble doesn't really have a built-in function to do loops. What they use is workflows, and that's kind of why we have to build it in this way. And so this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, but we'll work through it and do this together. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another workflow. We'll also give this a Z at the start, so they're right beside each other. Z demo shop single order. And I'm actually going to turn this off because we don't want this public. I could do the same thing here, just turn that off. And this new workflow is going to create that single line item in the database that we were talking about. So we're going to say data things, create a new thing. And this is going to be a demo shop order, right? And so we're essentially doing this step here that we were trying to do here, but it's going to be in this new workflow instead, and you'll see why a little bit later once we've gone through it. So we can create all these fields again. Okay, we have all 5 of these variables set, but what's the value that we're going to give it? So we can't make the API call because we already saw that that's not going to work. What we're actually going to do is we're going to take the API call here, and then we're going to do what's called schedule API workflow on a list, right? Because the information that we have here is actually a list. By passing a list to this other workflow, it understands that it should be looking at each individual line items one by one. And so that essentially works as a loop. So we're going to just select that there. And the API workflow is the one that we created here, right? Shop single order. And the type of thing is going to be actually the Shopify call that we made. So that was Shopify action API call. There we go. Okay. And it's going to should be orders, I believe. And the list to run on will be the results from step 1. There we go. Okay, so now this is blue. So what we had to do is we had to get the type to match the type that the list is being run on. And so because our list is being run on orders, so if we come back here, this is the list, right? So it says orders, it actually tells us it's a list. And in this list, we have these different fields. And in each one of these fields, there's numerous data points. And so because we actually care about this part of the API call, that's why we're setting it to the orders here. And that's why the type has to match as well, also order. Because if we go one step up or to a different type, then it's not going to match the list, and Bubble is going to recognize that and throw an error. And we're going to tell it to run
and give it a 1 second interval. Okay, so that's how you set up the scheduling, but this API workflow, we haven't actually completed it yet. So let's come back here. So we need to actually set what these values are. So we're going to run the workflow. It's going to pass this information into here and run them one by one, but we're still missing some of that setup. So what does this value equal? We're going to actually need to come up to the workflow object here and create some new parameters. And these parameters, I'm just going to call it workflow created at, and that's going to be type date, workflow purchases. I forget what the actual names were. So, okay, order ID, order name, purchases, and shop sales. So let's come back up here. So WF order ID, WF order name, and WF shop sales. So this one should be a number, this one's text, that one's text, and this one's a number. Okay, so we have a new variable or parameter that is set for each one of the fields that we need to complete here. And so if you remember a little bit earlier, we were talking about custom states, right? So those custom states were, if we came to this page and we set these values here. So we were talking about how these are like variables. We can change their values and they can be used in different parts of the page. Well, parameters in the backend workflows work similarly. So this is a variable that works only within this backend workflow. And so we create this so that when we call the workflow from here, you can see these parameters show up. And so now we can set what we're passing into these parameters so that this workflow here gets that data and can do something with it. And what it's going to do is actually it's going to set the values. So we're going to say created at is the workflow created at, and so on. So now we need to come back here and set what the values are going to be that we're going to be passing to this second workflow. And so what we're going to do is the result of step 1, and we're going to go to the orders and we're going to look for created at. Okay, and so now we are running into a problem. So workflow created at should be a date, but right now it's a list of date. And to resolve that, we actually chose the wrong one. So I was talking about how the result of step 1 was what we were looking for because that API call was made. Well, actually, it's this Shopify Action API call order. This is the one that we're using instead. So sorry about that. But what it will do is it recognizes that we're looking for a list, and then that problem no longer occurs because we are because this action here is about scheduling it on a list. So when we call this Shopify action, then it knows that's the list that we're looking for. For purchases, I'm just going to skip this one for now, and we'll come back to it after we finish the rest. So order ID is going to be ID. Order name is going to be name, and shop sales is going to be total price. Okay, so now we have this purchases here. And so what I've done is I've made a minor logical error by including this. So when we were looking at the purchases, we were actually getting a count of the number of items in this list. And that's how we place that there, right? So if we actually look at this formula, right? So we're doing a count of the number of orders. In this case, because we're actually performing an action on the list, each item in the database that's going to be created is a single order. So this value doesn't really make sense on a single order basis, right? So if we go back to this database here, when we create these values, each line item is a single order itself. So we actually don't even need this value at all. I'm just going to remove this from the workflow. So let's get rid of that there. And we can also probably just get rid of the data type field here as well. So we have the purchases here. We're just going to remove that. So now we only have these 4. Okay, so now that we've set this here, and we've set this here, which we're going to remove there, that should be complete. And we just need to get rid of this now because we no longer need that, because that action to create the database field is now in this new workflow. And so let's take a look at this this action here to call the API. So we wanted to set it to call within a certain date range, but we're not getting the parameters here. So we need to go back to the API call, and all of these are private. All right, remember, we actually set some to public. So we actually need to set those to public, reinitialize, and then we can save. So now we should be able to see those values there. And so let's remove that. And we want to set it to the same custom state we set earlier, right? So that was the test page start date and test page end date. But you can see that it's not pulling it up. And that's because the backend workflows and the front end workflows, they don't really speak to each other in the same way. So we don't have access to those states because this is all done on the Bubble servers, and you can only access them if you call the backend workflow with the parameters that we would set here. So we actually have to create some new parameters, right? So similar how we created these parameters, and they became visible when we called that workflow, right? So these parameters here, we can see them because we're calling this workflow here. So similarly, we have to create a workflow start date and a workflow end date. And when we call this workflow, those will become visible. And we're going to want to set this to be our workflow start date, and we're going to want to set this to be our workflow end date. So how do we trigger this workflow to start now? So we can come back to the front end, and we can trigger it in a number of ways. So probably the way you would do it in the long run would be based on time. So maybe not every 5 seconds, but we can set this to change once an hour or once a day or something like that. And then say we want to schedule an API workflow, and then the workflow will be able to find in here. So this is a list of all the backend workflows I have, but we've got our Z demos here. So we've got our shop workflow there. So if we do it this way, then we can set all these parameters and have it to run that way. But because I'm doing this demo with you, instead of having to wait an hour before that runs, let's create a button. So we'll come back over to the design page, and we'll just make a button here. And we'll call this get Shopify data. Okay, I'm just going to delete this text box now because we don't need that anymore. And now that we have this, we can add a workflow. And this will take us back to our workflows page. And so now it created a new workflow. When button gets clicked, right? The get Shopify button gets clicked, then we can create an action. And so that action we want to do is we wanted to schedule the API workflow. And the one we want to schedule is the Z demo shop workflow.
So we're going to get this to run right away. The start time can now be the custom state that we created, because now this button is on the front end, so we have access to those custom states that we created previously. So we're going to use those. Okay, so now that that's been set up, what we have is a button, right? So we have that button. When we click this button, it's going to schedule to run a different workflow. And that different workflow is going to be a backend workflow. So it's going to happen on the server side in the background, right? So it's just not going to affect what's happening right here on this page. And we're going to pass two pieces of information. We're going to pass the start date and the end date. And then when we go to the backend, so this is the backend workflows, it's going to first receive the start date and end date that we just passed, and then it's going to call a different workflow, right? So it's going to call this workflow right here for the single order and pass the list of data for each of the fields that we want. And then this workflow is going to, one by one, for each item in that list, create a line item. So why don't we give that a try? And what we're going to do actually is we're going to pull up the data here, and we're just going to watch this get populated after we press that button. So let's say we want this to be on the first and the second. So we're going to get 100, we're going to get 51 purchases. So we should expect to get, actually that's not quite, that shouldn't. Just want to make sure that that number is populating properly. Yeah, okay, I think that makes sense then. So what we're going to do is we're going to press this button, and we're expecting to get 51 items in our database. So you can see here now that it's starting to populate that data. All right, we've got the data was created, we've got the order ID, the order name, and the value. And so I'll just speed up through this part. Okay, so we have our 51 entries, which matches the 51 purchases we see here. All right. And now we can actually do some interesting things with it. One thing I'm seeing here actually is we're seeing some July 31st. So this is likely because of the way we passed the information to the database. Let's go back to the workflow where we pass this information. Okay, right here. So we're passing the test page's start date, but that start date, if you remember, is actually formatted in a certain way. If we look at it here, it's actually formatted like this. But if you remember, the date actually has to be formatted in this ISO 8601 format. And so if we go back to the backend workflow and we come here, we can actually format it because we're going to need to set it up to be in the format we want it so that it doesn't have that time zone shift that we're seeing here. So we're going to set this up, and then we're going to add this the time zone portion here afterwards. And then for the end date, we're going to do the same thing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to run this workflow again. But if we do, we're actually going to create duplicate entries in certain cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an additional action in front of this one right here. And we're going to actually delete the contents of the table first. And so in order to do that, we have to run a search for the values in that table. So demo shop orders. Okay, so let's just move this to the front. So now when we press this button, we're going to see all of these entries
get deleted first and then repopulated. So we can see here that they're disappearing, and then it's going to start repopulating soon. Looks like we have a bug still somewhere. So I think we still have a problem with the data structures, and this is just part of the debugging process we have to go through. So I'm just going to keep this all in here so that you guys can start to see some of the problems you can run into and what some of those solutions are. So what I'm going to try next is, instead of keeping these as dates, we're going to change them to texts. And what we're going to do is, instead of getting the data and formatting it here, we're going to format it before we pass it over. So let's just delete that. End date. Okay. So when we pass the start date and end date, it's currently being passed in the format of a date, but we're going to change it and format it as a text so that when it receives it, it's going to be a text form, and then we can use that as the parameter that goes into the API call in text format. So let's do that right now. So we're going to format this in our custom format. Okay, and then we're going to add the time zone component. And then we're going to do the same thing here. Okay, so let's try that again and see if that helps. So we've chosen a time range with 92 purchases. So our table is currently empty. Let's see if it starts to populate. There we go. So we got that working now. We're expecting to get about 92 purchases, or exactly 92 purchases, and we'll just speed up through this as it works. All right, so it got 145, which is more than the 92 we were expecting. So we do have a bug somewhere. So why don't we take a look at what it could be. So first, we can sort by the created at date, and we can see that the first order was on July 30th, and the date range we're selecting is July 30th. And the last order is on August 1st at 10:34 p.m. So I would actually trust this number better. And if I go to the my Shopify store, then I should be able to confirm that that's actually the right number. So I'm just going to do this on my second screen very quickly. So I know by looking at the Shopify analytics page in Shopify itself that the number of orders is actually 145. So this number is correct, but the number that we're showing here is not. So what's happening most likely is that there's an issue with the time that is being used in order to make this API call here. So as we know, the date picker defaults to 12 a.m. So let's just double check that we're not actually looking from July 30th, 12 a.m. to August 1st, 12 a.m., but we want to go to August 1st, 11:59 p.m. So the reason why it's showing up 12 a.m. here is because we're just showing the date picker's value as it is. But when we go to our workflows and we set the value of the end date, we've actually just set it to end date picker's value. So that's actually 12 a.m., not 11:59 p.m. And we wanted to change this to set the format, but actually if we set the format, then it'll be a type text instead of a date type. So we actually couldn't do that here. So instead of formatting it differently, what we're going to do is we're actually going to make a modification on the date itself. So the value, we're going to use this operator here. So we're going to add 1 day. All right. So what we've done here is we've taken the value of the date picker and made it 1 day later. So now we're at August 2nd, 12 a.m. And then we're going to subtract 1 second by doing this, -1. And this way, this gives us the end of August 1st by saying August if the date picker said August 1st, 12 a.m., it would go August 2nd, 12 a.m., -1, August 1st, 11:59 p.m. So hopefully that made sense. And we're going to need to do this every time we set this end date state. So let's do that for this one here. There we go. So now if we were to go from the 30th to the 1st again, we should be getting 145. We're still off by 2 orders. So I'm just going to do a little quick debugging to figure out why that's the case. I looked through the workflows off recording and found it was how the custom states were called. But since we're about to replace those values with the database entries anyway, we'll just go ahead and do that. Text boxes are being set by these custom states, so shop purchases and shop sales. And if we go to the workflows, then shop purchases is called through this API, and shop sales is also through this API. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to delete this, and it's going to be instead coming from the table that we created. So this is shop sales. We're looking for each item's shop sales, and then we're going to sum those values. And there we go. And let's do the same thing with the purchases. So we're going to delete all of this and then do a search for the table. And for this one, purchases is a count of the number of entries. So we're going to count. Now, if we do it this way, it's just going to count the entire table. So we actually need to add some constraints. So what's the constraint? We're going to look at the created at date, which is the order date, and we're going to compare it against our start date and end date that we have set right here, right? So we only want the orders that fall within the start date and end date set by the date time picker. So in this case, created at is greater than the start date and less than or equal to the end date. And that way we can be sure that the orders that we pick up are going to be within the date range that we're looking for. And so we'll do the same thing here. We're going to need to copy this over to the other ones. We're going to paste it here and we're going to delete the old one. And same thing here. We're going to paste it here and delete the old one. Okay, so now if I refresh this, we should be able to get the data coming from the table instead, and we should be getting the data coming in a lot quicker than it was before. So there we go, 145. And we can see that update quite a lot quicker than it used to because now we're not pulling from the API, it's just getting it directly from the tables. Now previously, when we're making our call to the Shopify Orders API, that there is a limit to how many orders can show up on the page. So when we set our call, we said limit equals 250. It's because we wanted the maximum allowable. So we can see that if we go to our API call here, where it shows limit is 250. So we can expand the time range that we're looking at to see where this problem might actually show itself. We only have 145 records in the table right now, so I'm just going to bring this out to a higher time frame. Let's say we're expecting about 500 now, and I'm going to hit our button there so that we're actually going to collect that data and store it in the table. And we'll come back in a few seconds when that's done. So it's done building the table now, and you can see there's 250 entries, but we were expecting almost 500. And that comes back to the fact that there's a limit of only 250 entries per API call. So how do we get more than 250? We have to do something called pagination, which is just going through different pages of the Shopify store. So there is a page here where it talks about how to do this, how to do these types of requests. And so if you can think of when we go to our orders page in Shopify, and we can go to different pages, and there's going to be a certain number of orders per page, the API is doing essentially the exact same thing. And to do that, we use a parameter called pageinfo, and pageinfo will return a unique ID, which will be found in the header URL. And we'll use that page info for the next API calls to call the next page. So let's go through an example on what that could look like. What we have here is Postman on the left to test the API calls, and Shopify on the right, so we can see the data that we might actually be looking at. Right now, we have a limit of 250 and a date range between July 21st and July 22nd. And so without setting the status, that also means that these are only for open orders. So the equivalent of what we would see in Shopify would be if we were to filter for open orders only. And if we were to add additional filters, we would select the date and select between July 21st and 22nd. So we see that there's 2 orders here, and we can double check if there's 2 orders on this side. If we come down here, there's 796 lines. So let's say if we were to change this to 2, what do we get? We still get 796. So that just tells us there's only 2 orders coming up. So that's the same filter here. If we wanted to expand the time range and go all the way to, say, August 1st, then we'll get a different number of orders. And then now we'll have many more orders with multiple pages. And so we can think of these pages as new API calls that we're going to have to make. So this page is an API call, and then we're going to go to the next page, and that's a separate API call. And that's how pagination works with the API calls. And so how do we actually do that? Well, there's a part of the API call called the headers. And in the headers, there's actually a link. In this case, it doesn't show up because actually there's only one page. We need to make an API call where there's multiple pages. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the status to any, because right now we're only looking at open orders. And yeah, we're gonna start from the 21st because we know that there should be more than 250 orders there. And we're gonna hit send. And if we stay in the headers area, there should be a parameter here that called link that shows up. There we go. So this long parameter here represents the code that we're going to need to feed back into the API using this pageinfo parameter to call the second page. So if we go back to Shopify, that parameter is used to get to the next page, right? So let's do that. So we're going to make a new request. Let's just duplicate this one and copy this over. And we're going to delete most of this. The reason being is that when you're using the pagination parameter, it actually doesn't allow you to use any other parameters with it. And so if we do end up using other parameters, then it doesn't give us the header link that we want. And so that's one of the limitations that they talk about right here. So that's why I've deleted all the other parameters except for the limit one that we wanted. And we're going to feed it the parameter that we saw from the previous request. So let's come back here. Let's get to the link here and copy this over. We'll place that in there and we'll hit send. And we need to set up our authorization because when we copied that, for some reason, it didn't get copied over. So let's do that real quick. And there we go. So this is the second page of that API call. And if we come back up here and we look at the link, we're going to see that the URL is actually even longer than it was before. And that's because there are two page info parameters. One that represents the previous page and a second one that represents the next page. And so how those two are being used is they act like the forward and back arrows that we can see in Shopify. So this would represent next, this would represent previous, and using those parameters allows us to go forward and backwards on the pages. And so those are the unique identifiers that allows us to do that. Okay, so now that we understand that concept, we need to build the logic in Bubble to handle this pagination and going through the different pages if there are more than one. Jumping back into Bubble, if you remember, we have our workflow. When the button gets clicked, we will delete the existing records inside the database, but then we're going to schedule this workflow where we feed it the date information, and then it will trigger this workflow here, which will have an API call. And then the data from that API call, each one of these parameters is sent as a list scheduling this workflow where all of the fields are populated. And so now we need to add a little bit more to it. And so this is starting to get a little bit more complex. And so I did a little bit of a drawing so that it can help us understand what's going on. And what we have set up in Bubble right now is something like this. So we have our date pickers and we have our buttons. So our button will grab the information from the date pickers, pass that date information to our first backend workflow. And that backend workflow is going to use that date to call the API and then pull that information to schedule the list workflow. It will pass that information and then create the single orders for the database. So let's add that in there. So all of the records will get put into the database like this, and then it will just end. And because we have a 250 order limit, it's going to stop at 250 at the max. But now we need to add additional pages. So that's going to look something like this, where we have a little bit of recursive calling of the API. So similarly, we have the date pickers and the button. So the date pickers and the button are going to call a first page API call. So if you remember, we were just talking about how that first page is going to be based on what sort of filters we set. So we had the date, the limits, the status. And so those are the four things that we wanted to add to our initial call, right? So these parameters right here, that's our initial call. We're going to grab that data and we're going to first create a single order. So let me just modify this quickly. So it'll look something like this. We're going to make that first API call. It will then populate the database with that first page. Afterwards, we're going to then make the paginated API call using the header URL that we collected in our first API call. And then we're going to, similar to before, where we scheduled this backend workflow here, we will do that again here. But once it's done with that page, it's actually going to go all the way back and repeat with the next page link, and so on and so forth. And it will just keep going until we're done. And that's how we can collect the additional pages. So let's start getting this set up in Bubble. We'll start with the first page API call, backend workflow. And what that is, it's just going to be a single instance of calling the secondary workflow, which creates the individual orders in the database. And if you remember, that's actually exactly what we've done here. This is a single call to this workflow, which will create the individual orders in the database. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to just copy this. And we're going to just rename this as first page. See, demo shop first page. And that's essentially what we need to do for that one. And for this one, we're actually going to have to build in some of that recursive function here where we're looping through. And so the first step is we have to make a paginated API call. So we're going to jump back into our plugins, and we have our Shopify API call, our Shopify Action API call, which is what we're using in this action here in the workflows. But if you remember, we actually need to set up the call a little bit differently using only the limit and page info parameters. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to create a new call. We'll call this this one's the Shopify Action API call. So let's call this Shopify Action Paginated API call. This is also going to be an action. And we're going to use the same URL, but the keys here are going to be the limit and page info. This is a parameter we're going to need to update each time we go to a new page. So we need to make sure that this is public, and we're going to allow it to be blank because the first time we call this, it's not going to have anything in it. What we're also going to do is we're going to need to capture the response headers, because if you remember when we were looking at the link here, the page info information is actually found in the headers. And so we need to retrieve that header info. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get to the next page. And so let's initialize that. Let's make sure the variable types are proper. So we have created at should be date. We had total price, which should be a number. And I think that should be fine. Okay, so let's save that. So now we're going to need to replace this action call with the new one. So we're just going to create a new action. We're going to find our Shopify order API action paginated. So this is the one that we created here. And then it's going to be looking for this parameter, page info. So we're going to create a parameter in here called page info, and that will be type text. And we're going to feed that page info into here. Okay. And so now we're going to bring this to the front, and we can delete this one here. Our second action is going to still be essentially the same logic. I think this just needs to be updated because this step that we were using is no longer there. So we'll just update using the new step 1 and the body orders. And so we just need to update our type to the new API call. And we had called it Shopify Action Paginated. And so we're just looking for the orders, body orders right there. And finally, we need to build in this recursive portion here where we restart the workflow by calling itself again, essentially. So we're going to recall this workflow to create a new set of orders based on that page. So what we're going to do here is we're going to schedule an API workflow, and we're going to choose this one here, ZDemo Shop Workflow. Okay, so we're going to set that so it starts right away. The start date and end date actually are not necessary anymore. So we're going to change, we're just going to delete these. But what we are going to do is we're going to add a new parameter called current page. And this is going to be a counter. So it'll help us loop through. So we'll say we want to collect 10 pages of results. And this will help us create the logic to do that. We're going to set up that logic right now. So first, we will set what current page is here. So current page is going to be equal to current page plus 1. And then we're going to use this only when modifier, which is a way to set conditions on how many times we're going to set this loop. So we're going to say we only want to run this for as long as current page is less than, let's say, 5. So at most it'll do 5 pages, and that will keep the number of orders that we're going to collect to be at a manageable rate so that we can look at the data right away, but also still test that the pagination is functioning properly. And so we also are going to need to set a initial value of current page, which should be 1, which we haven't done that yet, right? So let's think about when are we going to be calling this workflow, because that's when we set the initial state. So if we come back here, that first workflow is going to be called right after we do the first page. So the first page is actually happening right here. So we're going to call the workflow to populate the first page of results. And now we're actually going to trigger the rest of the pages. So let's do that right now. Schedule API workflow, and we're going to select Z shop workflows. And now it's going to ask us for what the current page is. So we're going to say 1. Well, first we're going to set the current date, and then we're going to set this to 1. And now we have the logic in place to first say, okay, we have triggered the first page. Actually, sorry, we're going to set this to page 2 because we've already populated the first page, and now we're going to work on the second page. And so that's why we're going to say this is page 2. And then once we go through here, we're going to keep adding 1 to the counter of how many pages there are until we reach 5. And once we reach 5, then this trigger is no longer going to tell the workflow to run, effectively ending the loop. Okay, so we just have one last piece to complete, which is to extract the data from the URL. And so this can be a little bit tricky because we have in our header this link here, and it's a lot of information there. So what we can do is split the text into different pieces using Bubble's split by function. And so let's take a look at what that could look like. First, let's come back to the API call and let's reinitialize and take a look at the structure. So we have the body orders, and then if we scroll down, we should get the headers right here. So each one of these is a different item, but it's contained in the header. But what we care about is the headers link. And so this is the variable we're going to be looking at and what we're going to be doing some text manipulation on. Okay, so we can start with, say, the shop first page, and we are going to want to pass that URL to our secondary workflow so that when the workflow calls the API, it knows which page it should be calling that information on. And so let's do that right now. All right, so first let's extract the URL piece. So that's going to come from our API call. But we don't see the headers there. And that's because we had only requested the headers to be saved for the new paginated call. So we actually have to update this one to include the headers as well. So let's do that, reinitialize, and let's save. Now we can come back and look for the header link to resolve that issue there. And once we pull the header link, it's going to pull the entire URL. So if we look at the link, we can see there's the My Shopify URL and different parameters. But what we need to extract is only the piece right here, which is the page info for the next page. And in order to do that, we need to do some text manipulations on the header link. Just a quick pause here. In the next part, I'm going to be showing how to extract the page info parameter, but I get right into it. So if you're not following along, I pull out a notepad file later to give a better visualization of what we're doing, so you can skip ahead to that part. All right, let's get back to it. And so if we take a look at this link, we can see that there's a single comma here. And this comma is between the previous and the next. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to mark a spot for the URL to split. We're going to go split by, and we're just going to put the comma there. Next, we're going to select the last item. This time, we're going to split by this parameter here. So it's going to find the first part before this text and a second part which comes afterwards. And again, we're going to pick the last item. And finally, we're going to do a final split, this time on this text right here, which will leave behind only the page info parameter value as the first item. So this is how we can extract the page info parameter from the link. Just so this makes a little bit more sense, I'm going to open up a notepad file and demonstrate what we were doing here. Okay, so let's say this is the URL link that we were manipulating with, and we had this comma. So we say split by this comma, which creates two items. One item with this highlighted information, and a second item with this highlighted information. And so that's what that split by comma means. And we're selecting the last item, which is what we've currently highlighted. So we can just kind of pretend that this part goes away. Next, we're doing a second split by, and we're splitting by page info equals. So this right here. So we're going to create two parts. One part that comes before it, which is that, and a second part which comes after that. And we are again selecting the last item. So we can just pretend this all goes away because we're selecting the last item. And finally, we're doing a final split by with this text right here. And there's really only going to be one item because it's the first item before, and there's nothing that comes after. And so we're saying first item, and we're going to delete that, which will leave us behind the parameter we're looking for. So that's the logic that we just did there to extract the page info parameter. Okay, so we're going to need to do the same thing over here. So what we can do is we can copy this expression and paste it here. And we're going to want to make this result of step one. There we go. Now we can see we still have some issues. So let's take a look at what's missing here. Okay, so the API call is saying we're missing the page info, but actually, if we come back here, the first call should be to the first page API. So our API call is no longer going to trigger this workflow, but it's going to call this workflow, which will then in here call our primary workflow. So let's do that right now. We're going to change this and we're going to call the first page. And those dates are based on the date picker. So that should resolve that issue. Now we've got a few more. So let's take a look. We have schedule, single order on a list is not an option. So let's click this and see what the issue is here. Okay, so we need to select the API call that we created earlier, which was called the Shopify Action API call. So let's go ahead and do that. Shopify Action API call. And the type should match the list to run on. There's still an error. So we're going to need to find the right order type. We had previously changed this, but because we added the headers, it changed the format of the API call a little bit. So we need to come back here and select our Shopify Action API call body order. And that resolves that. And then our parameter here should be date, but right now it's a text. So we need to come back and we need to reinitialize and make sure that the data type is a date. Sometimes when you reinitialize, it reverts back to its default. So we have to be careful of that. And the other one is the shop sales should be a number, but right now it's text. So total price also needs to be changed to a number. There we go. And that should resolve this issue. So now that we have no more issues, we can give this a try and see if it works properly. We are, as a reminder, going to be looping through up to 5 pages. So we're certainly going to have more than 250 entries. And so let's give that a try. So we're going to refresh our page here. So we're going to select a date range that has more than 250 entries. So let's do something like this. Facebook says there should be at least 500. So this is a good number to work with. We should expect in the region of 500 to 550 purchases, I would think, from this date to this date. So let's try that now. And then I'll come back once this is done processing. Okay, so we're now complete. We can come take a look at the database and we can see there's 554 entries, starting from July 23rd, 12 a.m., ending August 2nd, near midnight. And so this is how we can use workflows to create an iterative function, sort of like a loop, to go through different pages on your Shopify API call. We also covered some conditional statements. So this is sort of a conditional loop where we are only looping for this many pages. In this case, because we are doing 250 entries per page, there's only 3 pages, so the loop ended before then. But had we had more, it would have ended a little bit sooner either way. We've now covered everything you need to know to recreate your own Triple Whale dashboard. We didn't take it to the very end, but from here on out, you should be able to add any metrics you want to your dashboard. This was a long one, but I hoped it helped you interact with the Shopify and Facebook ads APIs. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching this video, and see you in the next one.